Hey, Chef Ro here. Today we're going to talk about salt. There are so many different kinds of salt out there, and sometimes people get really confused because there's so many types to choose from, and so many people say different things about different kinds of salt and how they're only the kind of salt to use. I'm going to tell you the different types of commonly found salts and even a couple interesting ones that I have laying around, and really, in my opinion, the differences between them and what I personally use them for. Here on my plate, I have a bunch of different salts lined out here. We're going to start over here and work our way this way. This first one is what most people use until you start using kosher, but this is iodized salt. Now this came about because people didn't get enough green leafy veg for a while, and so they started getting goiters because they didn't have enough iodine in their diet, so they started putting iodine in salt. Iodized salt. These days, if you eat your vegetables or take multivitamins, you should be fine. You will not get goiters. And iodized salt has kind of a weird metallic aftertaste to it that you will start noticing if you start using a different salt. So, in my opinion, iodized salt, the only place it belongs in my house is for cleaning or gargling. Some people call it table salt. But when recipes are written, they are never written for iodized salt unless they specifically say table salt. When recipes are written, they are always made using kosher salt. Now, kosher salt has actually nothing to do with being kosher. It is the type of salt they use to kosher meat or make it kosher. So even though it's called kosher salt, it's not that it's more kosher or less kosher than any other salt. It's what they use to make the meat kosher. Now I have two different brands here. This is the one that most people know. It's got a bigger flake to it. That's why I don't prefer this brand. It's a bigger flake. So when you mix it into a sauce or something, you have to wait a little bit for it to dissolve before you taste again, or else you're going to add more thinking it needs more, and then it'll all dissolve and you'll have oversalted your food. This is my preferred brand. If you notice how fine it is, it's almost as fine as an iodized salt. It's called Diamond Crystal. A lot of professional chefs use this one. It's a cleaner one in my opinion. It doesn't have anti-caking agents in it. So sometimes it will clump up, but you just got to use your fingers to do it. But it is the cleanest tasting kosher salt in my opinion. Okay. And this I use for all my cooking. Okay. While the food is cooking, kosher salt. Okay. Now this, starting over here, is when we're going to start getting into sea salts. Now, a lot of people say that if you're trying to cut back on your sodium, you use sea salt. There is some truth to that because sea salt is about twice as salty. Because if you go teaspoon for teaspoon on, say, a Malden salt and a kosher salt, they have the same amount of sodium content. However, sea salt usually is much saltier, and therefore you use much less of it, which is why if you're trying to work on cutting back on sodium, you use sea salt, and you'll use less of it and get the same effect. Okay? Now this one is one of my very favorite finishing salts. Finishing salts are salts that you put on the dish at the end of cooking, right before you serve it. It adds a nice crunch, and it's something that you can do to do something called seasoning the eye of the meat. So like if you have a big steak and you cut it into slices, and you only seasoned the outside while it was cooking, so now you can sprinkle a little of this over the inside so all of it is seasoned. Also, it'll give you some nice crunch and some texture to it. Now this is Malden Salt. It's a British salt. It's very distinctive. It has these little pyramid shapes to it. You can always tell Malden Salt by the pyramid. And the thing about sea salts is that they start tasting different based on where they're harvested, because it's the minerals that are in the water in that locality. So sea salts from different parts of the world are going to taste different. Okay. Now this is pink salt, but very specifically Himalayan pink salt. This is not to be confused with this pink salt. This pink salt is a curing salt. It's actually naturally white. They have to add pink to it because it's sodium nitrite. Poisonous if eaten straight. Fine when you cure meats because it degrades over time, but you don't want to sit there and sprinkle this on your potato. Bad things will happen. Okay, so, but Himalayan pink salt, a lot of people like to cook with this one because it's a clean tasting sea salt. I again use it as a finishing salt. Don't worry, I don't leave it this big. I have a salt grinder, which is a lot like a pepper grinder. So you can see I have a salt grinder. And so that's what I use if I'm going to add salt at the table after the dish has been seasoned. That is the kind of salt I use. Okay. Here is a gray salt. This comes from France. This is very similar to Fleur-De-Celle. Fleur-De-Celle is something that a lot of people love, and it's really, really great. It's a coarser salt than most of these. It's not quite as coarse as this, but Fleur-De-Celle is much like champagne, where it can only be called Fleur-De-Celle if it's harvested from one very specific area called Camargue in France. But a lot of people really love it with their eggs, especially because it doesn't really fully dissolve, so you still get a little bit of crunch inside there. Fleur-De-Celle is also frequently used in things like a salted caramel. If you see the little white squarish on top, that is a Fleur-De-Celle. This gray sea salt does the same basic concept of that, and that's what I use this for. Black salt is a really fun one. Usually it's mixed with activated charcoal, which makes the flavor of it very, very clean. It comes from Hawaii generally. It's called black lava salt, right? Black lava. Goes really exceptionally well as a finishing salt for seafood, especially if you talk raw fish preparation. This is my go-to salt for that because it adds a nice crunch and it's a nice clean salt. Okay, this one similar. It's a Hawaiian Red Salt that's made red by the clay where that is. Again, finishing salt, great for seafood. This one we used to use when I worked at a catering company on top of the pats of butter that we served at the tables. That way the butter was salted because most restaurants and catering companies, any food service establishment generally only holds on to unsalted butter because that's what they use in the cooking. So it's hard to order salted butter for serving and unsalted butter for cooking because you got to keep them separate and make sure nobody uses the wrong one. This adds some nice crunch and some salt to the butter at the table if you wanted to do that. Okay? But again, recipes, when they are telling you that you need a teaspoon of salt, they're talking kosher. Not iodized, not sea salt, kosher. Unless they specifically say otherwise. Hopefully this has been able to help you understand all the salts available to you. Now, most people aren't crazy like me and have 10 kinds of salt sitting in their house, but they do all kind of have different purposes. So you'll find that having a couple kinds, maybe one finishing and one cooking salt, that is what a lot of people do. Now, some people who use the ones that I use for finishing, for example, Malden Salt, they'll use it for cooking and that's fine, but if it's a really large crystal, you really need to crumble it in your fingers just a little bit before you use it in cooking, or else, again, you need to add it to your food, wait some time before you taste it for seasoning and adding more, because you need those larger crystals to dissolve, which is why I like the finely ground diamond crystal kosher salt, because it just dissolves and I never have to worry about it. Hopefully this has been informative and now you know how to choose your salt.